Okay, so good morning everyone. So this morning we are going to tackle about the Gestalt Psychology or the Gestalt theory. So Gestalt theory is an initial cognitive response to behaviors. So it emphasizes the importance of sensory wholes and dynamic of visual perception. So the term Gestalt means form or configuration. So guys, take note that the Gestalt theory emphasizes the importance of sensory and the visual perception. So Gestalt theory is a psychological approach that suggests we perceive things as a whole, unified structures rather than just a collection of individual parts. So this means that our brains naturally organize information to form complete images, patterns, or concept. Okay, let's say for example, a picture of square that is made up of broken lines or broken dot. So our brain will still recognize it as a square because our minds naturally fill in the gaps to see the whole image. So this way of processing will help us quickly understand complex scene and objects around us. Okay, let's go to the proponents of this theory. So let's talk about the proponents and the backgrounds, including their contributions to this theory. So first is Max Wertheimer. So he was born on April 15, 1880 and died on October 12, 1943. So he originally studied law at university but soon switched to philosophy and psychology. So Max Wertheimer introduced the concept of phi phenomenon, which explains how we perceive motion in a sequence of still images such as in movies. So this laid the foundation for understanding the perception as a whole rather than as a collection parts. So second is Wolfgang Kohler. So he was born on January 21, 1887 and died on June 11, 1967. He is a psychologist and co-founder of Gestalt Psychology. So he made many contributions to science. He is best known for his empirical studies of chimpanzee problem solving. So he conducted experiment with animals, particularly with chimpanzees, to demonstrate insight learning. So third is Kurt Kofka, a German psychologist and was born on March 18, 1886. So he died on November 22, 1941. Kafka conducted much experimental work, but he is perhaps best known for his systematic application of Gestalt principle to a wide range of questions. So he introduced key concepts and applied Gestalt theories to various areas, includes child development and perception. So these three proponents made a unique contributions to the development of this theory.
So let's take a look at the Gestalt principle. So in order to further understand Gestalt psychology, let us tackle its principle. So first, we have here the law of proximity. So in law of proximity, the elements that are close together will be perceived as coherent object. So when we say coherent object, it is logical and it is clear. So in law of proximity, objects that are close to one another are grouped together. So let's take a look at the image. In this image, we can see that there are circles, right? So our brain instantly groups those images into two for their arrangement and closeness to one another. So if you take a look at the picture, you can see that there are two rows of circles, and because they are close to one another, we instantly group them together. So we have here two groups, the left and the right. Okay, so another example in the classroom setting. So when a teacher sometimes group his or her class, the teacher would group them, let's take for example per row or column, just because they are closer to one another to to save more to save them from any hassles. So they can group them easily by grouping the students who are close to one another. Law of similarity. So in law of similarity, elements that look similar will be perceived as part of the same form. So sometimes we link similar elements together. Or in other words, we tend to see objects that are similar together as one. So we tend to group them together. So let's take a look at the image. So in the image, or in this image, our brain group objects based on their similarities. So in the image, we can see red dots and blue dots, right? So we tend to group the red dots together and the blue dots together. So another example, let's take for example in Ifugao State University. Whenever we have intramurals, we get a certain type or a certain kind of color in which we are required to wear. Like for example, in education, college of education, we wear blue t-shirts. In CASD, we have green. In CET, we have red. CCJE, we have gray, and etc. So through those colors, we can distinctly group students based on their colleges. Okay, so they are grouped together. So let's take a look at the law of closure. So in law of closure, we tend to fill the gaps or close figures that we perceive. So we enclose space by completing or ignoring the gaps in the figure to make it a whole, to make it seem like they are complete. So when our brain sees an image with missing parts, it tends to complete those images by filling them in our heads. So let's take for example the image. So in the image, we can see a line forming an image, right? So we have here the lines. We call that, what do we call that? Lines. So in this picture, our brain automatically starts filling in the missing part, forming an image of a diamond. So this is through our imagination. Through our imagination, we see the image as a whole, that there is no hole between the lines and it is complete. That's why we can see a diamond. Okay? We assume that there are lines even though there are none. Law of good continuation. In law of good continuation, individuals tend to continue contours whenever the elements of the pattern establish an implied direction. So people tend to draw a good continuous line. People perceive a continuously flowing smooth line even with interruptions. So once that a pattern is established, it seems like the flow of the line is continuous. So let's take for example in the image. So in the image, we can see a line of dots. So our brain instantly seemingly form a wave of line despite the gaps or despite any interruptions that happens. So we are following it as if it is a flowing smooth line. So our brain organizes this as a smooth flowing line despite the gaps. Law of good pregnance. So in the law of good pregnance, reality is organized or reduced to the simplest form possible. So we expect certain patterns and therefore perceive that expected pattern. So in the image, we can see a circle entangled with each other in a repeated pattern. So seemingly, our brain perceives and follows this pattern. And we follow that there are circle, 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 circle. Okay? So you can see it in the image. Now let's talk about the law of figure or ground. So in the law of figure and ground or ground, we tend to pay attention and perceive things in the foreground first. So a stimulus will be perceived as separate from its ground. So we perceive images into a figure, object, and ground, which is the background. So our brain tends to identify which is the figure and the ground. So let's take a look at the image. Take for example the image. So in the image, one might say that they see two human figures facing each other, right? So in that case, the figure is the silhouette of the two faces facing each other, while the ground is the black background behind the silhouette. Okay? So on the other hand, one might see a black face on a white background. So the black vase is our figure or object, and the white background is our ground. So depending on what you see, depending on what image or what image that you see, and that's how you determine your object and your ground. Okay? So we have talked about the Gestalt psychology, their proponents, and their principles. So let us talk about the insight learning that we can see in Gestalt psychology. So Kohler proposed a view that insight follows from the characteristics of objects under consideration. So his theory suggests that learning could evolve when the individual perceives the relationships of the elements before he reorganizes these elements and comes to an insight. So it is important that you try to understand the relationship between each elements before you draw an insight, because through that you can make an insight about that certain situation or that certain object. So this could occur without reinforcement, and once it occurs, no review, a greater understanding, or weighing or investigation is necessary. So significantly, insight is not necessarily observable by another people. So insight is not necessarily observable by another person. So we have our own insights, and sometimes we tend to draw our insights from our understanding. So we talk about the principles of the Gestalt principle, and we can see that we tend to draw an insight, or we tend to think of an object based on their, or the meaning of an object based on their forms, on their appearance, on their distinctive qualities. So we tend on their patterns, of course. So we have our own insights. So people have different or varying insights, and because they have the free will. Okay, so we are different from each other. So Gestalt principle and the teaching learning process. So Gestalt principle influence perception and psychology, with Lewin's theory focusing on the life spurt, emphasizing inner and outer forces affecting learning. So Italian psychologist Mario Polito highlights the relevance of Gestalt psychology to education, highlighting its impact on individual motivation, attitudes, and feelings. So Gestalt theory emphasizes the importance of contact between teachers and students, focusing on life, space, and complexity of experiences. So it encourages learning as an experience and the source of learning. Okay, so recognizing the affection and meaning attached to learning, it emphasizes the importance of autonomy, freedom, and respect for assimilation and cognitive remodeling. So through learning about, or through understanding the connection of everything, or the reasons behind an action, we can easily learn, or we can easily grasp the lessons that we are trying to get from that situation. So we try to understand the relationship of each happenings from each other. So there are, we can say that sometimes there are patterns, there are obvious similarities, and through those patterns, similarities, differences, and etc., we tend to learn more, or we tend to understand the situation, and we can handle it better. Okay, so that is the Gestalt psychology. So in conclusion, Gestalt theory, it is a school of thought based on organization and perception of information. So we have talked about its principles, and you can see that we tend to organize information through what we perceive an object is, okay, and how we group them, and how we tend to classify them from one another. So our mind tends to perceive things as a part of a whole. So furthermore, we have ways of organizing that information and tend to use that information to interpret situations. So that is Gestalt theory. Thank you for listening.